The quietness of Maple Ridge Lane was never real. It was the kind that smothered complaints beneath manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. When Evelyn Morris moved into house number 113, she didn't come to make friends or join block parties. She came for peace, for solitude, and to finally enjoy retirement away from the noise of her past life in corporate risk management. But she had no idea she was stepping into the domain of Judith Becker, HOA president, self-declared enforcer of order, and a woman who treated the bylaws like a holy text. Evelyn kept to herself. Her lawn was neat, her shutters painted the approved shade of colonial blue, and her mailbox was regulation height. But then she installed a small security camera above her garage. That was the spark. Judith saw it during one of her morning compliance walks, when she pretended to jog but actually scanned the houses for violations. By noon, Evelyn had an envelope on her doorstep. Security apparatus not pre-approved. Please submit a request for exterior modifications form. Evelyn raised an eyebrow and ignored it. The next day, another envelope, a warning, then a fine, $50, then $100. Evelyn responded with a certified letter citing state law. Nothing in HOA rules could supersede her right to monitor her own property. That should have been the end. But to Judith, it was war. Things escalated fast. Lawn inspection notices started arriving weekly. Noise complaints followed. Even though Evelyn lived alone and barely used her TV, Judith filed a report claiming Evelyn's floodlight was a nuisance to neighboring aesthetics. Evelyn installed blackout shades. Then came the accusation that she was spying on the neighborhood. Judith, standing outside with two other board members, pointed up at the camera and said, "She's monitoring us, possibly recording private conversations." Evelyn had enough. She invited the HOA board to her porch, handed them each a printed copy of the HOA charter with highlighted sections proving she'd violated nothing, and closed the door in their faces. What she didn't expect came 2 days later. 9:43 p.m., a Friday. Police lights bathed her driveway in red and blue. She opened the door to flashlights and voices. "Ma'am, step outside. We received a 911 call reporting suspicious surveillance activity and possible firearms on the premises." Evelyn blinked. "You've got to be kidding." But they weren't. She stood on the lawn barefoot while they swept her home. They found nothing. No weapons, no crime. Just a woman who liked her privacy and installed a legally mounted camera. When Evelyn asked who made the call, the officers exchanged looks. "It was anonymous," one said, but the report was detailed. She knew. She didn't need proof. Judith had crossed the line from annoying to dangerous. Evelyn filed a complaint with the sheriff's department, citing misuse of emergency services. It stalled. HOA presidents were notoriously difficult to prosecute. Too many gray areas, too many committees. But Evelyn didn't back down. She started documenting everything: dates, times, letters, video clips. She set up a private server to back it all up. Then she contacted an attorney, not just any attorney, Brandon Hale, a specialist in HOA abuse cases and a former prosecutor with a reputation for burning down boardroom dictators. When he read through Evelyn's compiled file, his response was simple: she messed with the wrong woman. Brandon filed a cease and desist against Judith personally, not the HOA, forcing her to respond as an individual. She didn't like that. That week, Evelyn's driveway was egged. Her trash bins were pushed into the street. Her rose bushes, perfectly pruned, were slashed at the root. The camera caught a blurry figure at 2:17 a.m., tall, wearing a hood, no face. Evelyn handed the footage to the police. No follow-up, but Brandon filed for a restraining order, and a judge approved it. Judith, when served, stood on Evelyn's sidewalk and screamed for 10 minutes about tyrants and outsiders ruining community integrity. Neighbors started to notice. The perfect illusion of Maple Ridge Lane cracked. One couple down the block, the Sandersons, admitted to being fined for painting their fence without visual review. Another homeowner said she was cited for inconsistent seasonal decor because her wreath stayed up one day too long. Brandon saw an opportunity. He opened a class action complaint. By the end of the month, 17 homeowners had signed on. Meanwhile, Judith doubled down. She hosted emergency board meetings, sent out flyers accusing Evelyn of bringing lawyers into community matters, and even mailed anonymous letters to other residents claiming Evelyn was a threat to neighborhood safety. Evelyn didn't react. She simply waited. And when Judith's 911 call log was subpoenaed under court order, it showed her name, her voice, and her script. The woman at 113 is armed, possibly ex-military. Surveillance everywhere. "I don't feel safe." A blatant lie. And now, a felony. The sheriff's office reopened Evelyn's complaint. An investigator took over, quietly, carefully, and then, on a rainy Thursday, Evelyn watched from behind her blinds as an unmarked sedan pulled up in front of Judith's house. 2 plainclothes officers got out. 15 minutes later, Judith was in cuffs. Not for the HOA, not for the fines, but for the 911 call that weaponized fear and wasted public resources. She was charged with filing a false police report and targeted harassment. The neighborhood was stunned. Some defended her, some turned silent. But Evelyn didn't care. She wasn't there to make friends, she was there for justice, and it had finally arrived. What no one knew, not yet anyway, was that Evelyn had only just begun. Judith Becker's arrest had sent a tremor through Maple Ridge Lane that no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. For years, she'd reigned over the neighborhood like a monarch hidden behind bylaws, penalties, and passive-aggressive newsletters. But now, for the first time, the HOA residents had seen her in handcuffs, led away under a gray sky by detectives who didn't care about community standards or violations. They cared about law. And Evelyn Morris, who had once been viewed as the recluse of house number 113, suddenly wasn't invisible anymore. Still, the silence around the neighborhood thickened. No one brought casseroles, no one knocked on her door to say, "You were right." They just watched from windows, glanced away during morning walks, or hurried past when they saw her in the driveway. Evelyn didn't mind. She knew that fear and guilt had strong roots, especially when people realized they'd watched abuse. That happened and said nothing. Meanwhile, Brandon Hale pushed forward with the civil action. With Judith suspended from the HOA pending investigation, the remaining board members scrambled to create distance. A special meeting was held, no recordings allowed, where it was whispered that Judith's actions were independent, not representative of the board. But Brandon had documentation, emails, meeting transcripts, and proof that Judith hadn't acted alone. Several board members had approved her decisions, co-signed her fines, and enabled her abuse. The lawsuit expanded. Evelyn was the lead plaintiff, but she had support now. The Sandersons shared that they'd paid over $3,000 in fines in 5 years. Much of it for infractions that weren't even in the official bylaws. A single mother down the street, Madison Taylor, revealed she'd been fined for leaving her children's bikes on the lawn twice. Another man, a retired Navy officer named Carl Dunlap, told Brandon he'd been pressured to repaint his home's trim 3 times in a year due to shade inconsistencies. These weren't just overreaches, they were acts of targeted control, disguised as governance. As the court date neared, Evelyn's life changed. She wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was a symbol of resistance. Local media picked up the story. Headlines read, HOA president arrested for 911 abuse after war with homeowner. Evelyn declined interviews but allowed Brandon to release key facts. The video of Judith screaming on Evelyn's sidewalk after being served the restraining order went viral. Comment sections filled with HOA horror stories from across the country. People sent letters, some offering legal advice, others sharing personal trauma. Evelyn saved everyone. She started walking each morning now, not just to stretch her legs, but to be seen. She wore a calm expression, said nothing unless spoken to, but her presence was a reminder. The HOA no longer owned this neighborhood, but Judith wasn't finished. Released on bail and awaiting trial, she retreated behind her shutters, but her influence still lingered. Flyers began appearing on neighborhood doors and signed, but clearly her tone. They warned residents about outside agitators, claimed Evelyn had political motives, and accused the HOA lawsuit of destroying property values. Someone spray-painted traitor on Evelyn's curb one night. Security footage showed a figure in a hoodie, moving with intention, spray can in hand. Evelyn submitted it to the police, but again, there was no arrest. "We're watching it closely," the detective had said, "but she's smart, she's not careless anymore." Meanwhile, Brandon uncovered something deeper. As part of the lawsuit's discovery process, he'd obtained financial records from the HOA's treasurer. What he found was astonishing. Over $92,000 spent in the last 3 years under the budget line labeled community preservation. That money was meant for park maintenance, sidewalk repair, and seasonal decorations. Instead, it had been funneled to unlicensed contractors, surveillance equipment, and compliance operations that had no real documentation. One payment was made to a private security firm that no longer existed. Another was for legal consultancy paid directly to an account registered under Judith Becker's maiden name. Brandon submitted the evidence to the DA's office. The civil suit now had the weight of criminal investigation behind it, but Evelyn remained careful. She kept her cameras running, checked locks twice a day, and backed up footage every night. Because even though the walls were closing in around Judith, people like her didn't surrender, they imploded. And that kind of fallout didn't stay confined. The court issued a gag order to prevent Judith from contacting any plaintiffs. She violated it within a week, sending an anonymous letter to Carl Dunlap, accusing him of betraying the community and hinting that his service dog was not properly registered. Carl had the handwriting compared to old HOA notes, same loops, same pressure points. That violation landed Judith back in front of the judge. Her bail was revoked. She was taken into custody for contempt. This time, there were no headlines, just a quiet ripple through Maple Ridge Lane as the lights in Judith's house stayed off for weeks. Grass began to overgrow the edges of her perfect sidewalk, a symbol crumbling. Evelyn, meanwhile, won the first legal round. The judge ruled that the HOA had exceeded its authority in several cited incidents and that the plaintiffs had standing to pursue damages. The trial date was set for the fall. Brandon estimated it would take 2 to 3 months to resolve. Evelyn didn't care how long it took. She wasn't going anywhere, but the stress was visible. Her once smooth hands now shook slightly when she held her coffee. She slept with one eye open, and yet, every morning, she still opened her curtains, watered her flowers, and walked with purpose down the same street where she had once been invisible. That street was watching her now, not with scorn, but uncertainty. Was she a hero? A threat? A warning? Evelyn didn't need their approval. She had the truth, and in this neighborhood, that was more powerful than any rule book. Evelyn Morris had never imagined that defending her property from an overreaching HOA would evolve into a courtroom war zone involving financial crimes, false 911 calls, and personal attacks. But the deeper they dug, the more rot they found under the polished surface of Maple Ridge Lane. With Judith Becker now behind bars, awaiting trial for repeated violations of a court order and criminal misuse of emergency services, Brandon Hale redirected his focus on the civil suit, pushing hard through discovery to unearth the full extent of systemic abuse. What emerged wasn't just negligence or board-level incompetence, it was a coordinated scheme. Evidence revealed that over the last 5 years, Judith and 2 other board members had leveraged their authority to target homeowners who didn't conform to their vision of neighborhood perfection. The HOA bylaws had been amended without proper votes. Secret fines were enforced outside of protocol, and in some cases, property values were deliberately manipulated to pressure residents into selling below market rates those homes then quietly acquired by LLCs tied to the same board members. Evelyn sat in stunned silence as Brandon laid out the timeline. It was no longer just a matter of bullying or ego, it was calculated control, and the weapon was the HOA itself. Even more alarming was the revelation that multiple 911 calls had been made from Judith's address over the past year. Each time the subject of the report was a plaintiff in the lawsuit. The calls had been made anonymously but bore a pattern, describing the same fabricated concerns, weapons, threats, suspicious behavior. The sheriff's department, under mounting pressure, had reopened its investigation. They began cross-referencing calls, timestamps, video footage, and phone records. Subpoenas followed. It became clear that the abuse of emergency services wasn't just a one-off outburst, it was strategy. And Judith wasn't acting alone. Her closest ally on the board, Michael Trent, had maintained a quiet demeanor throughout the conflict. He'd kept his name out of public documents, voted in abstention, and never addressed the media. But as Evelyn reviewed HOA meeting notes, she noticed a pattern. Every major enforcement action had been seconded by Michael. When Brandon dug further, he uncovered that Michael operated a private property consulting firm, one that had profited directly from 3 recent home flips within Maple Ridge, all bought at reduced prices following repeated fines and legal pressure from the HOA. The connection was undeniable. Brandon amended the civil suit again, naming Michael personally. Evelyn, now emotionally fatigued but determined, spent her days reviewing documents, backing up files, and walking her property with a body cam affixed to her jacket. She'd become a fortress, still calm, still polite, but armored against any further manipulation. Meanwhile, support from the community grew in whispers. More residents came forward quietly, emailing Brandon with their stories. A family at Lot 9B revealed they'd been cited for a non-permitted playset, even though it had been approved in writing 2 years earlier. Another elderly man shared that he'd been fined for neglecting to pressure wash his sidewalk, despite medical records proving he was recovering from surgery at the time. The pattern was undeniable. It was no longer Evelyn versus an HOA president, it was residents versus a corrupted power structure. The court approved Brandon's request for a forensic audit. Within weeks, a team of specialists began combing through HOA bank accounts, vendor contracts, and even surveillance purchase orders. Among the findings was an invoice for a community monitoring system that had been installed without resident consent. Dozens of discrete cameras placed on HOA-controlled property aimed toward private homes. Evelyn's camera picked up one such device nestled in a neighborhood tree, aimed directly at her driveway. When presented with this evidence, the city council called an emergency session. The mayor issued a public statement condemning the actions and promising municipal review of all registered HOAs in the district. The fallout spread fast. News vans returned. Headlines now read, "Hidden cameras, fraud and retaliation. The HOA that turned into a surveillance state." Evelyn stayed inside most days, only emerging for legal meetings or early morning walks when the street was still quiet. Her mailbox was flooded with letters of support from people around the country who had faced similar abuse. Some sent baked goods. One anonymous package included a used HOA violation notice with the words, "You're our hero," scribbled across it in blue ink. But the damage took its toll. Evelyn hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in months. Her health began to waver. During a deposition, she fainted dehydration, exhaustion, stress. She refused to quit. "They want you tired," Brandon told her. "They want you to burn out so the system keeps winning." She nodded, quiet, resolute. The next court date brought a new twist. Judith's defense team argued she had been under mental distress and claimed she had no memory of making certain calls. They submitted psychiatric evaluations, suggesting a deteriorating emotional state. Brandon wasn't surprised. "They're going to try the sympathy angle now," he told Evelyn. But it didn't hold. The court reviewed logs, recorded calls, and emails each meticulously planned, timed, and targeted. The judge denied the motion to suppress. The criminal trial would proceed. Meanwhile, Brandon arranged a town hall meeting for Maple Ridge residents under the HOA but through an independent neighborhood committee. Dozens attended. Some cried. Others confessed their silence. Evelyn stood quietly at the back, listening. When a resident asked her to speak, she paused, then stepped forward. "I didn't do this because I wanted attention," she said. "I did this because no one should feel unsafe in their own home, especially from the people claiming to protect it." Applause followed, not loud, but genuine. For the first time, Evelyn saw neighbors not as bystanders, but as people reclaiming their own voices. Brandon filed a final motion petitioning to dissolve the HOA permanently and transfer governance to an elected neighborhood council. The vote would take place in 30 days. In the meantime, Judith's house sat dark. Her yard, once the cleanest on the street, was overgrown and spotted with weeds, a silent monument to what abuse of power ultimately becomes. Evelyn walked past it one morning and didn't even look up. She had nothing left to prove. Now it was about finishing the fight for herself, for the neighbors who'd suffered quietly, and for every homeowner across the country watching her case, hoping for justice. The approaching vote to dissolve the Maple Ridge Lane HOA stirred a quiet storm that no one could ignore, not even those who had stayed silent for years. Lawn ornaments that had once triggered citations now returned overnight. Children's bikes once hidden in garages now rested freely in driveways. The neighborhood felt different, looser, uncertain, but also more human. Evelyn Morris watched it all from her front window, not with pride, but with caution. This wasn't over, not yet. The criminal trial against Judith Becker had been set for the following month, and while the civil case advanced steadily, there were still efforts behind the scenes to reverse the damage. Michael Trent, Judith's second-in-command, had gone silent after being named in the amended complaint, but silence didn't mean surrender. Evelyn received an unmarked envelope containing photos, grainy shots of her walking alone, grocery shopping, unlocking her front door at night. No message, no signature, just images. It was intimidation, pure and calculated. She handed them to Brandon Hale, who immediately filed a police report and requested the court reinforce the protective order. Meanwhile, the forensic audit continued to reveal deeper corruption. Over $200,000 in community funds were now unaccounted for. Checks had been issued to companies that didn't exist, including a landscape firm tied to Michael's cousin and a legal consulting firm that traced back to a P.O. box in Judith's maiden name. Several residents, now emboldened by Evelyn's leadership, demanded a public hearing. The mayor arranged for it to be held at the City Hall auditorium. Brandon Hale attended with Evelyn and a few other plaintiffs. A crowd filled the room. Reporters stood at the back, and for the first time, the story of Maple Ridge Lane was spoken aloud before city officials. Resident after resident stood and told their story. A young couple who'd lost their loan approval after being fined multiple times over a child's sandbox. An elderly widow who paid over $5,000 in assessments for sidewalk repairs that never happened. A disabled veteran who'd been threatened with legal action over a non-compliant mailbox installed by the developer. Evelyn spoke last. Her voice was steady, her hands still. "This began with a camera I installed to feel safe, and it led to a 911 call that could have ended my life. The only reason I'm standing here today is because I fought back. Not everyone can, and that's why this has to stop, not just here, but everywhere." The mayor paused before responding. "This isn't just a neighborhood issue anymore. This is a governance failure." The city officially recommended the dissolution of the HOA and placed a freeze on all remaining funds. A court-appointed trustee was assigned to oversee the transition. That night, Evelyn walked the neighborhood for the first time in weeks. Number jacket, no camera, just her, breathing the autumn air. A few neighbors waved. One brought her a pie. Slowly, the curtain of isolation lifted, but her guard remained. Days later, someone lit a fire in her recycling bin. It was caught early and caused no major damage, but it was enough to shake her. The fire department ruled it intentional. Brandon had a suspect, Michael Trent, but with no camera footage or fingerprints, there was no arrest. Evelyn reinforced her home security system, upgraded her lighting, and met with the district attorney. "You're too close to the truth," the DA told her, "and people like Trent don't go quietly." The court hearing to officially dissolve the HOA arrived. The judge heard all arguments, reviewed the audit results, the 911 abuse logs, and the financial discrepancies. After 3 hours, the judgment came down. The Maple Ridge Lane Homeowners Association was officially terminated. Its charter was revoked, its funds seized, and its officers barred from forming any future neighborhood governance without city oversight. Evelyn didn't celebrate. She simply nodded and thanked the judge. But Judith's trial was next, and the stakes were higher. The charge, filing a knowingly false emergency report with intent to harass, paired with misuse of HOA authority and financial misappropriation. Her defense team tried again to plead mental instability. But the evidence, notes, videos, emails, told a different story. The court saw a pattern, a woman who used fear as a weapon, who built a structure of control around her personal insecurities, and who nearly destroyed a community in the process. Evelyn testified on the thirdday.com/measured. Truthful didn't just call 911 on me. She created a system that made people afraid to live in their own homes. Her words landed hard. By the end of the week, Judith was found guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled. She faced up to 5 years. As she was led out of the courtroom in cuffs, she looked at Evelyn for the first time in months. Her face wasn't angry, it was blank, empty. Evelyn stared back, unflinching. She had nothing left to say. But the consequences weren't just legal. The story hit national media. Talk shows debated the power of HOAs. News outlets called it the HOA war that changed everything. Other neighborhoods reached out to Brandon Hale asking for help, guidance, protection. Evelyn began receiving letters from across the country. Some called her brave, others called her dangerous for daring to challenge the norm. She kept every letter a binder full of stories, victims, fighters, survivors. She wasn't alone anymore, yet part of her still lived in caution. One evening her phone buzzed, a blocked number. When she answered, no one spoke. Just breathing, she hung up. Another letter arrived 2 days later. No return address, no message, just a clipping of a newspaper headline about her trial, circled in red. The sheriff's office was notified, but Evelyn knew what it meant. Judith may have fallen, but the structure she built, others still believed in it. She looked out the window. Her red maple tree rustled in the wind. It was planted the day she moved in, a symbol of peace. Now it stood taller than ever, because roots, once deep enough, don't shake in a storm. Not anymore. Months had passed since the HOA was dissolved, and Judith Becker had been sentenced to 3 years in prison. The neighborhood of Maple Ridge Lane was no longer the same sterile, controlled environment it once pretended to be. The perfect silence had been replaced with a cautious normalcy. Some homeowners felt relief, others confusion, but no one could deny the shift in power. The carefully trimmed uniformity was gone. Children's chalk drawings returned to sidewalks. Porch plants grew in unapproved colors, and the anxiety that once lingered in every parked car and out-of-place garbage bin had started to fade. But Evelyn Morris remained vigilant. She had seen what unchecked authority looked like, how easily it hid behind friendly neighborhood smiles and monthly newsletters. She had become, whether she wanted it or not, a symbol, not of resistance alone, but of what happens when someone refuses to break under systemic pressure. She had stopped answering unknown numbers. Her doors remained locked twice over. The court had ruled in her favor, and the stories had faded from the headlines. She knew the scars remained in her, and in the people still quietly sending her messages from across the country. One morning in early spring, she stood on her front lawn with a cup of tea, watching as city crews removed the rusted HOA sign from the neighborhood entrance. The bolts snapped one by one, and with a quiet thud, the last piece of the old regime hit the ground. She didn't smile, she just nodded. That afternoon, a knock came at her door. It was Madison Taylor, the young mother from 2 houses down, one of the first neighbors who had quietly supported her through the lawsuit. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood Carl Dunlap, the retired Navy vet, and Madison held a folded sheet of paper. "We'd like your permission to nominate you for something," she said. "The city's resident council is forming a civilian advisory panel for HOA oversight. It was your case that started it. They want someone who understands the damage these systems can do." Evelyn stared at the paper for a moment, then stepped aside and motioned them in. They sat around her living room where stacks of binders still rested on shelves, documentation, records, receipts. She hadn't thrown anything away. "Not yet. I never wanted this," she said. "But I suppose I'm not done, am I?" That night, she filled out the form, not because she wanted recognition, but because she knew the system would rebuild itself eventually. New names, new rules, the same dangers. She wouldn't let it happen unchecked. A week later, her appointment was confirmed. Evelyn Morris became the first civilian appointee to the state HOA advisory board. She attended her first meeting in a modest gray blazer, walked past city officials who had once dismissed her as just another disgruntled homeowner, and took her seat at the far end of the panel. When asked for a statement, she stood slowly, scanned the room, and said, "This isn't about banning rules. It's about keeping power in check. No board should ever make someone feel unsafe in their own home." Applause followed. She sat down, her hands steady. Back at Maple Ridge Lane, life moved on. Judith's house went up for sale and was purchased by a young couple unfamiliar with the neighborhood's dark past. They painted the shutters red, installed a swing set, and planted daisies in the yard. Evelyn watched from her porch and, for the first time in years, felt something close to peace. She started walking again every morning, every evening. The same path she had once walked while under surveillance now walked freely. People waved. Some apologized. Others simply nodded. She accepted them all, not because she needed validation, but because she understood the weight of survival. One evening she passed the old community notice board. The cork was empty, its frame faded. She pulled a folded slip of paper from her coat pocket, pinned it to the center, and stepped back. It read, "If you feel something is wrong, you're probably right. Trust yourself. Speak up, be loud." She didn't sign it. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who had written it, and those who didn't would hear the story soon enough. Evelyn returned home, placed her keys on the counter, and sat in her red maple-shaded porch chair, the one she refused to remove. As the wind blew through the trees and the sun dipped behind the roofs, she closed her eyes. The war was over, and she had won not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after.